The message no one was supposed to read. At 2:17 in the morning on June 6, 1944, inside a guarded room in southern England, a young naval wireless operator sat with headphones pressed hard against her ears while the channel disappeared beneath rain and darkness. The room was not dramatic in the way battlefields are dramatic. There were no muzzle flashes outside the window, no tanks grinding forward, no men falling into mud, only dim lamps, thin cigarette smoke, damp wool uniforms, and paper moving from hand to hand with the quiet urgency of people who knew that a mistake might not explode here, but somewhere else. A radio set hissed, then cracked, then steadied for a few seconds. The operator leaned closer. Across the channel, German units were still waiting for the invasion they knew must come. They had spent years preparing for it. Concrete bunkers faced the sea. Artillery crews slept beside their guns. Panzer formations waited behind the coast, held like a fist that had not yet opened. In headquarters rooms from Paris to Berlin, officers studied maps marked with arrows, beaches, ports, rail lines, and guesses. Many of them still believed the real Allied blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais. That belief mattered. It mattered as much as ammunition. It mattered as much as steel. Because if a commander believes the main attack is still coming elsewhere, he holds back. He waits. He protects the wrong door while the real one is being forced open. In the British room, another strip of paper arrived. A clerk carried it across the floor. Someone looked up from a map. Someone else rubbed tired eyes with the heel of a hand. The message did not announce victory. It did not say the war was won. It was only a fragment, one small piece of German thinking pulled from the air. But fragments were what this war had become. Not always grand plans. Not always complete orders. Sometimes only a call sign. A change in transmission volume. A unit name appearing where it had not appeared before. Pattern in silence. A nervous message sent at the wrong hour. The people in that room were not storming a beach. They were not flying through flak. They were not inside the steel belly of a landing craft, watching the ramp and wondering if the man beside them would still be breathing in 5 minutes. Yet what they handled could decide where those men would meet resistance, how quickly German reserves would move, and whether the enemy still believed the wrong story. This was the strange power of the silent weapon. It had no barrel, no trigger, no recoil. It did not shake the ground when fired. It did not tear a hole through armor or bring down a bridge. Often, the men saved by it never knew it had existed. Often, the men killed because it arrived too late never knew how close someone had come to seeing the danger ahead. It lived in listening posts, in code rooms, in naval tracking centers, in tired hands turning intercepted chaos into usable warning. The Axis had believed that secrecy belonged to those who encrypted their messages. They believed that if a machine scrambled the words, the meaning was locked away. They believed speed, radio coordination, and discipline would keep their plans alive until the last possible moment. And for a time, that belief was reasonable. Modern war moved too fast for silence. Submarines needed orders. Aircraft needed targets. Divisions needed instructions. Supply ships needed routes. Headquarters needed reports. The Axis war machine, spread across oceans, deserts, occupied cities, and frozen fronts, depended on radio the way a body depends on nerves. But nerves can be traced. Every signal sent into the air was a small act of exposure. Every message had a time, a rhythm, a source, a destination. Even when the words remained hidden, the act of speaking could betray fear, movement, urgency, or confusion. On June 6th, as landing craft moved toward Normandy through rough water and men vomited into their helmets, the silent war behind the visible war continued. A voice came through static. A machine printed another line. A map was adjusted. A conclusion hardened slowly in the minds of people who had learned to distrust certainty. The Germans still had guns on the coast. They still had soldiers in bunkers. They still had commanders who believed they understood the invasion. But what they did not fully see was that their confidence had already been under attack for years. Not by shells, but by listeners. And before dawn broke over the beaches, before the first wave hit the sand, before the world began remembering D-Day through smoke and blood and surf, Another battle had already taken place in rooms where no one raised their voice. The question was not whether the Allies could land. The question was whether the enemy would understand what was happening quickly enough to stop them. And the answer had begun forming long before the first ramp dropped. The fortress of secret communication. The German officer who trusted his cipher machine was not a fool. That matters. It is easy, many decades later, to look backward and imagine arrogance where there was also logic. The Enigma machine looked secure because, in practical terms, it was meant to be. Its rotors turned letters into other letters. The settings changed. The procedures were layered. To the men who used it in field headquarters, U-boats, air stations, and command posts, it offered something essential in a war that stretched farther than any single commander could see. It offered the promise that orders could travel without being understood by the enemy. A panzer unit could be redirected. A submarine could be given a patrol area. A Luftwaffe formation could receive instructions. A commander in North Africa could ask about fuel. A naval headquarters could coordinate wolf packs across the Atlantic. The message would leave one hand as plain language. It would enter the machine. It would come out as nonsense. And somewhere else, with the right settings, it would become meaning again. For the Axis, this was not merely technology. It was confidence made mechanical. German doctrine prized speed, concentration, and initiative. Orders had to move quickly. Reports had to return quickly. A commander who waited too long for perfect information might find the battlefield had already moved on without him. Radio helped solve that problem. It allowed forces to act across distance with a rhythm older armies could not match. In the early years of the war, that rhythm seemed devastating. Poland collapsed. France fell. British forces escaped at Dunkirk but left much behind. German submarines prowled the Atlantic. Rommel's columns drove through North Africa with a speed that seemed almost insulting to the men trying to predict him. Japanese forces across the Pacific and Southeast Asia moved with a shock that left Allied commanders scrambling to understand where the next blow would fall. From the Axis point of view, surprise still belonged to the side that moved first and spoke securely. And at the front, that belief could feel like reality. A radio operator sitting beside a Panzer command vehicle did not see the whole war. He saw dust, fuel cans, maps folded and refold, officers shouting over engine noise, antennas trembling above moving columns. When orders arrived and the unit turned, the machine had worked. When messages left and no enemy artillery immediately answered, secrecy seemed intact. A U-boat commander in the Atlantic saw the same thing differently. He saw darkness, wet steel, stale air, men sleeping beside torpedoes, and radio messages that seemed to guide him toward prey. Somewhere a convoy was crossing. Somewhere escorts were tired. Somewhere merchant sailors were watching the water and listening for the sound every sailor feared. The dull shock of a torpedo striking home. To him, the ocean was vast enough to hide him. Encryption made it larger. But there was a hidden weakness inside this confidence. It was not always in the machine itself. Often, it was in the human world around the machine. Operators repeated phrases. Procedures became habits. Weather reports followed patterns. Call signs changed imperfectly. Messages were sent under pressure. A tired man made a small mistake because he had made the same motion 1,000 times before. A unit transmitted too often. A headquarters asked for information at an unusual hour. A submarine broke radio silence because command demanded coordination. War did not allow perfect discipline. War made men tired, and tired men leak patterns. The Allied listeners learned this slowly, painfully, not as a single revelation but as a craft. A signal intercepted in Scotland might mean little by itself. Another caught in England might add a piece. A direction-finding station could estimate where it came from. A clerk might notice that the same unit appeared with unusual frequency. A naval analyst might connect that spike to convoy routes. A codebreaker might find a crib, a repeated phrase, a procedural weakness. The weapon was not one thing. It was a chain. At one end, the enemy believed he had spoken into darkness. At the other, someone began to see a shape. This is where Axis confidence began to face a battlefield it did not understand. Not the battlefield of tanks and artillery, where courage and command still mattered. A different battlefield. One where the act of giving orders became dangerous. One where silence was safer but impossible. One where the more complex the war became, the more messages it required. And the more messages it required, the more it exposed itself. The Germans believed their encryption was a wall. What really happened was that every wall had doors, and not all of them were made of steel. Some were made of routine, some of haste, some of human assumption. Across Britain, Allied interception sites listened through rain, static, and long nights. Young women wrote down groups of letters they did not understand. Men with tired eyes compared patterns. Machines clicked and turned. Naval officers plotted positions on maps where lives moved as pencil marks. No one at the front could hear this battle. But it was beginning to alter the terms of all the others. And the strangest part was this. Even when the Allies could not yet read the words, they were learning to read the enemy's behavior. That was the first crack. The second would come from the people the war had almost hidden in plain sight. Every secret had to travel through the air. A radio signal does not look like fear. It does not carry a face. It does not show a man's hand shaking. It does not reveal whether the sender is cold, hungry, bored, or terrified. To the intercept operator, it arrives as sound and rhythm. Bursts, pauses, static, sometimes faint enough to seem imagined. But war has patterns, and patterns can become confession. In a listening station along the British coast, an operator might spend hours hearing almost nothing that seemed important. The work was not cinematic, could be numbingly repetitive. Headphones pressed into skin, pencil marks on paper, tea gone cold, eyes burning from low light. Outside, fields and roads continued as if the world were ordinary. Inside, the air was filled with invisible movement. Then something changed. A station that had been quiet began transmitting. Another answered. A call sign appeared again. Message traffic increased. A frequency came alive. Direction-finding equipment suggested a source at sea, or near a known command area, or somewhere that should not have been active at all. The words might still be locked. The behavior was not. This was the hidden problem inside Axis communication. Encryption could conceal content, but it could not conceal the need to communicate. A fleet preparing to move speaks differently from a fleet at rest. A nervous headquarters speaks differently from a confident one. Submarines converging on a convoy create radio traffic. Aircraft preparing raids leave traces. Supply shortages produce requests. Movement creates chatter. Crisis breaks discipline. Sometimes the most important message was not what the enemy said. It was that he suddenly had to say so much. This was the territory of traffic analysis, direction finding, and disciplined patience. The Allied system collected not only words but context. Who transmitted? When? For how long? From which approximate direction? Was the signal urgent? Did it repeat? Did it match earlier behavior before an attack? Did silence itself mean units had gone to sea? To a general trained to think in divisions, aircraft, and artillery, these details could seem thin, too fragile, too indirect. A pencil mark on a chart did not look like evidence in the same way an aerial photograph did. But over time, the marks accumulated. A single footprint in mud tells little. A trail tells more. The Atlantic made this brutally clear. A U-boat did not need to speak often to endanger itself, but wolfpack warfare required coordination. German submarines had to report convoy sightings. They had to receive orders. They had to be directed toward prey. The ocean was huge, but the radio narrowed it. Allied high-frequency direction finding, known as HF/DF or Huff-Duff, did not need to read every word. If it could locate the source of a transmission quickly enough, it could place a threat on the map. For a convoy escort commander, that could mean the difference between guessing and acting. Imagine the bridge of an escort ship at night. The deck slick with salt. A cold wind cutting through coats. Lookouts scanning black water where every wave could hide a periscope. Somewhere below, men sleep in short, nervous intervals. A signal is detected. A bearing is taken. The plot changes. The ship turns. Depth charges are prepared. No one sees the submarine yet, but the invisible has become directional. That was enough to change behavior, and behavior is often what decides survival. In occupied Europe and North Africa, the same logic applied in different forms. A headquarters that sent unusual traffic before a movement could reveal timing. A supply network under pressure might expose its strain through repeated requests. A unit moving into a new area might appear as a pattern before it appeared as a force. Allied analysts learned to see war as a living system, not a collection of isolated messages. The Axis believed security meant hiding the words. What really happened was that war itself kept giving away its pulse. There was also another danger for the Axis. The more confident a system becomes, the more routine it becomes. And routine is the friend of the listener. Men who believe a channel is safe tend to use it. Men who use it often create habits. Men under pressure fall back on those habits when discipline becomes difficult. No machine can fully protect a human system from being human. The people collecting these traces rarely saw the consequences directly. A young woman might copy a signal and never know that it helped reroute a convoy. A direction-finding team might pass along a bearing and never see the destroyer alter course. A clerk might file a message group that, hours later, contributed to a conclusion at a higher level. The war was divided into compartments. Most of them were silent. That silence had a cost. It meant recognition did not come. It meant families heard vague explanations. It meant operators carried memories they could not explain. It meant a person might spend a night helping save a ship and spend the next morning unable to tell anyone why she looked exhausted. But in those rooms, a new kind of battlefield literacy was being born. They were learning to hear movement before movement became visible. They were learning to detect pressure before pressure turned into attack. They were learning that the enemy's confidence depended on a world in which messages vanished after they were sent. They did not vanish. They lingered in notebooks, on tapes, in bearings, in repeated mistakes, in the quiet attention of people trained to notice what others dismissed. And as the signals piled up, the war began to shift toward the people who could interpret them. The listeners were ready. The commanders were not always ready to believe them. The listeners no one saw. Many of the people who fought this silent war looked nothing like the public image of a warrior. They were young women in naval uniforms with ink on their fingers. Civilian mathematicians who had never commanded a platoon. Linguists, clerks, crossword obsessives, engineers, chess players, typists, dispatch riders, filing room staff, and junior officers who learned to speak in cautious phrases because a wrong conclusion could kill men they would never meet. At Bletchley Park and in the wider network of Y stations, the work did not feel like legend while it was happening. Felt like shifts, rules, fatigue, security checks, bad weather, trains in the dark, paper, endless paper, letters arranged into groups, messages sorted, copied, carried, compared. The people inside the system did not possess the whole picture. That was deliberate. Secrecy protected the work by breaking it into pieces. One person intercepted, another copied, another sorted, another analyzed, another attacked the cipher, another passed the result through channels so restricted that even senior commanders might see only what they needed, not how it had been obtained. For the young operator wearing headphones through a night shift, the war entered as sound. Not speeches, not flags, sound. A burst of German Morse could arrive sharp and urgent, then vanish under static. The operator had to stay with it. A missed group might matter. A wrong letter might break a chain. Fatigue was not an excuse the Atlantic would respect. Somewhere, a convoy might be moving through waters where a submarine had just reported contact. Somewhere, a desert column might be waiting on fuel. Somewhere, a German headquarters might be revealing a belief the Allies needed to confirm. The work demanded emotional restraint. A person could not gasp at every possibility, could not celebrate every promising signal, could not collapse every time a message suggested danger. The system required accuracy before feeling, but they felt it. How could they not? A line of traffic might imply that ships were being hunted. Another might suggest an air raid. A decoded fragment might reveal that the enemy was preparing something large. The people handling it often knew just enough to understand that real bodies existed beyond the paper, and not enough to know whether those bodies would survive. This is where the documentary must slow down, because the silent weapon was not only machines. It was concentration under pressure. It was someone staying awake when the mind wanted to blur. It was someone refusing to treat a repeated phrase as meaningless because repetition itself had become suspicious. It was someone noticing that a call sign appeared where it should not. It was someone saying, quietly, that pattern has changed. No fanfare, just the beginning of a decision. The military world did not always know what to do with such people. War loves visible courage. A pilot returns with holes in his aircraft. Men can count them. An infantryman holds a position. Others can see the ground. A destroyer attacks a submarine. The explosion leaves evidence. But what is the shape of courage in a listening room? It might be the discipline to report uncertainty honestly. It might be the refusal to exaggerate. It might be the strength to say that a signal suggests danger but does not prove it. It might be the burden of knowing that if your work succeeds, no one can publicly thank you, and if it fails, the sea will take the evidence. The Axis did not see these people. That was part of the weapon. German commanders saw Allied ships that were not where they expected. They saw defenses prepared too well. They saw attacks on supply routes. They saw deception working with uncomfortable precision. But they did not see the hands that copied their messages or the tired analysts who translated volume into meaning. And because they did not see them, they often misidentified the danger. They blamed spies, reconnaissance, radar, bad luck, treachery, poor discipline. Sometimes those explanations had truth in them. Intelligence rarely works alone. It is strongest when combined with aircraft, patrols, deception, captured documents, prisoner interrogation, resistance reports, and ordinary military judgment. But beneath many Allied advantages was a quiet accumulation of intercepted signs. The underdogs of this story were not underdogs because they lacked intelligence. They were underdogs because the system they served could not openly admit their value. Many were young. Many were female in a military culture still shaped by older assumptions. Many held no rank that would make a battlefield commander pause. Yet they were seeing parts of the war that frontline officers could not. They saw movement before contact. They saw anxiety before retreat. They saw preparation before assault. And sometimes they saw that the enemy still believed he was hidden. That realization carried its own tension. If the Allies acted too clearly on secret knowledge, the enemy might change the system. If they failed to act, men might die. Every use of the silent weapon involved a calculation. How much can be done without revealing why? In ordinary battle, a weapon exposes itself by firing. This one had to injure confidence without being seen. That made its operators something unusual in war. People who could help change events while remaining absent from the story for decades. But absence does not mean insignificance. In the coming battles, those unseen hands would begin reaching into the Atlantic, the desert, and finally the invasion of Europe itself. First, however, there was the question that haunted every breakthrough. Could the enemy truly be read? And if so, could that knowledge be used without destroying the very source that made it possible? Reading the enemy without being seen. The idea sounds cleaner now than it was then. Break the code. Read the message. Win the battle. That is the simple version, the version history sometimes tells when it is in a hurry. The real work was messier, slower, and more uncertain. It involved machines, yes. It involved brilliant minds. But it also involved failure, false starts, partial readings, missing settings, captured scraps, routine mistakes, and the constant fear that the enemy might change procedure and plunge the Allies back into darkness. The German Enigma system was not opened by a single miracle. It was attacked from many directions over time. Polish cryptanalysts had done crucial work before the war, work that helped lay foundations others would build upon. British teams expanded the effort. Machines were designed to test possibilities faster than human hands could manage. Mathematicians and engineers looked for patterns. Linguists and military specialists looked for predictable phrases. Naval intelligence studied habits. Operators searched for tiny cracks in procedure. A cipher machine may look cold, but it lives inside human behavior. And human behavior is never perfectly random. A weather report might contain predictable language. A routine message might begin in a familiar way. An operator might make a mistake and send something twice. A lazy procedure might create an opening. A captured codebook or key sheet might provide temporary advantage. A repeated phrase, known as a crib, might allow analysts to test whether they had found the right path into a message. None of this meant certainty. It meant possibility. A room might spend hours chasing one possibility only to watch it collapse. A promising line of attack might fail because a setting had changed. Naval enigma, especially, could become brutally difficult. Submarine traffic was often more protected, and the stakes were enormous. A failure there was measured not in embarrassment but in tonnage sunk, ships lost, men drowned in oil and cold water. The men and women doing this work had to think like the enemy without becoming careless about him. They had to respect the system enough to study it seriously, but not so much that they believed it invulnerable. They had to exploit the gap between what a machine was designed to do and what exhausted human beings actually did in war. This was not romance. It was grind. The bomb machines turned and clicked. Paper moved. Possibilities were tested. Rotors were imagined in positions they might have held at the moment of transmission. A correct result could open a door for hours or days. A wrong one could waste precious time while convoys crossed dangerous water. And even when a message was broken, another problem began. How do you use the enemy's secret without showing him that you possess it? If a convoy suddenly changed course every time U-boats approached, German Naval Command might suspect compromise. If Allied aircraft attacked every supply ship after a related message, Axis headquarters might tighten procedures. If reserves moved too perfectly before every assault, the enemy might look not to the battlefield, but to his own communications. The silent weapon had to be masked. Aerial reconnaissance might be sent to discover what was already known. Patrols might be routed in ways that appeared routine. Commanders might be given intelligence stripped of its origin. Sometimes the Allies acted indirectly. Sometimes they waited. Sometimes they paid a price to protect the source. That price is uncomfortable. It should be. A weapon that must remain hidden can never be used as freely as a gun. The people handling ultra and related intelligence lived inside that tension. They knew the value of what they had. They also knew it could vanish. A single German suspicion, if strong enough, might force procedural changes that would close the window. The Allies would be deaf again in places where listening had become survival. So the silent weapon did not strike like artillery. It seeped into decisions. A convoy route altered slightly. An escort group reinforced. A reconnaissance flight arranged. A deception plan evaluated. A commander warned in language that concealed the source. A map adjusted because a secret message had made an enemy intention more probable. The Axis believed their encrypted systems turned speech into darkness. What really happened was more unsettling. Their messages entered a contest between machine discipline and human imperfection. And in that contest, the Allies did not need perfection every day. They needed enough fragments, often enough, to change the odds. A soldier on a ship in the Atlantic would never see the bomb machine. A tank crew in the desert would never meet the clerk who handled the intercept. A paratrooper waiting for D-Day would never know that German belief itself was being monitored. But all of them lived closer to survival because someone had learned to read without being seen. Still, a weapon proves itself only under pressure. Not in a guarded room. Not on a chalkboard. Not in theory. Its first great test would come in a place where the night was wide, the water was black, and men disappeared so completely that sometimes only floating wreckage remained. The Atlantic. Convoys in the Black Atlantic. At night in the North Atlantic, a convoy could feel less like a fleet than a moving town without lights. Ships spread across dark water in columns, each one heavy with fuel, food, ammunition, vehicles, aircraft parts, mail, and men trying not to think about how cold the sea was beneath them. Merchant sailors listened to engines throb through steel plates. Escorts rolled in heavy swell. Signal lamps were hooded. Cigarettes were hidden. No one wanted to give a submarine even the smallest gift. The German U-boat commanders believed the ocean favored patience and nerve. They were not wrong. The sea was enormous. A submarine could vanish beneath weather and distance. It could wait under a convoy's path, strike, dive, and leave behind burning oil, broken timber, and men calling out in darkness. Wolfpack tactics turned individual submarines into coordinated hunters. One boat sighted the convoy. Others were ordered toward it. The pack gathered. The night attack began. For Allied sailors, the first torpedo was terror. The second was understanding. Somewhere out there, more were coming. The Axis belief was simple enough. If U-boats could find the convoys, concentrate against them, and overwhelm the escorts, Britain could be strangled. Factories needed imports. Armies needed equipment. Civilians needed food. The war depended on ships crossing water where German submarines waited. But the Wolfpack had a weakness. It had to communicate. A submarine that found a convoy became valuable only if it could tell others. That report, however brief, entered the air. HF/DF stations and escort ships could take bearings. Intercept operators could mark the timing. Analysts could compare patterns. If the content was broken, even better. But even when it was not, the act of transmission could betray the hunter's presence. This did not make the Atlantic safe. Nothing made it safe. It made it readable. Imagine an escort commander on a destroyer bridge in bad weather. The ship rises, falls, shudders. Spray lashes the glass. Men speak in clipped voices because too much emotion wastes breath. A bearing comes in. Possible U-boat transmission. The commander looks at the plot. The convoy is slow. The escorts are few. If he turns away too far, he leaves a gap. If he ignores it, a submarine may close. There are no clean decisions at sea. Only decisions made before certainty arrives. The silent weapon did not always hand commanders a complete answer. It gave them something more valuable than comfort. Warning. A direction. A suspicion strong enough to act upon. Sometimes a convoy could be rerouted before entering danger. Sometimes escorts could be sent toward a contact. Sometimes aircraft could be directed over areas where U-boats had surfaced to charge batteries or send reports. To the U-boat commander, the result could feel uncanny. A convoy expected along one route was suddenly not there. Escorts appeared with sharper timing. Aircraft arrived in waters that had seemed empty. Depth charges fell after a transmission that had felt necessary and safe. He might not think first of broken codes. He might blame reconnaissance, luck, radar, a spy in port, a careless signalman. All were possible in war. That uncertainty mattered, because confidence at sea is not loud. It is quiet, private, and necessary. A submarine crew lives inside steel, pressure, stale air, and trust. Trust in the boat. Trust in command. Trust that the ocean remains large enough to hide them. When events begin to suggest that the enemy is anticipating them, that trust becomes harder to hold. The Allied side paid heavily before the balance shifted. Ships burned. Men froze. Lifeboats drifted. Convoy commodores watched vessels vanish from formation and had to keep the rest moving because stopping might do more. The silent weapon saved lives, but never all of them. It reduced blindness. It did not abolish danger. By 1943, the Atlantic struggle began to change in ways U-boat crews could feel even when they could not fully explain them. Escort groups improved. Air coverage expanded. Radar, sonar, codebreaking, direction finding, training, and industrial production came together. No single factor carried the whole burden. But signals intelligence helped connect the parts. It allowed the Allies to avoid some traps and spring others. Black May 1943 would later stand as a turning point in the U-boat war. Verify precise framing and figures. German submarine losses rose sharply. The hunters were now hunted more often, and the confidence that had carried them through earlier years began to suffer under the weight of repeated failure. What they had believed was that the ocean and encryption made them invisible. What really happened was that every necessary whisper into the air could narrow the ocean around them. For the merchant sailor, that difference might be felt only as an uneventful night. Course change. A suspected danger avoided. The absence of an explosion. Survival often leaves no dramatic image. The ship simply reaches port. Men step onto a wet dock and smoke in silence. Cargo is unloaded. The war continues. But on maps in guarded rooms, those uneventful nights meant something. They meant the silent weapon had begun to work under fire. And once commanders saw that invisible knowledge could save ships, they began asking what else it could do. Across the Mediterranean, in the desert, another Axis confidence was about to meet the same quiet pressure. This time, the battlefield was not water. It was sand, fuel, distance, and a commander famous for moving faster than his enemies could think. Rommel's war meets invisible eyes. In the desert, distance lies. It makes an army look freer than it is. A tank column can race across open ground and appear unstoppable from a distance. Dust rises. Engines roar. Tracks bite into sand and stone. Officers lean over maps with grease pencils and confidence. To the men watching from the other side, speed itself can become frightening, as if the enemy has escaped the normal limits of war. For much of the North African campaign, Erwin Rommel seemed to embody that fear. His reputation was built on movement, boldness, and the ability to strike where opponents were not ready. British and Commonwealth soldiers knew the feeling of being outmaneuvered. Units found themselves flanked, supply lines threatened, positions turned. Rommel's name carried weight because his actions had given it weight. The Axis belief in North Africa was not simply that German and Italian forces could win by fighting harder. It was that operational daring could compensate for distance, supply weakness, and Allied material strength. Move fast enough. Strike sharply enough. Keep the enemy unsettled. Make him react. For a time, the desert rewarded this. But the desert also punishes illusions. Every mile required fuel. Every tank needed maintenance. Every shell had to be moved across sea and sand. Every truck burned more of the supply it carried. A brilliant maneuver could become useless if the fuel did not arrive. A commander could read the map perfectly and still be defeated by a port, a convoy, a road, or a shortage he could not wish away. The hidden truth of the Desert War was logistics. And logistics speaks. Axis supply routes across the Mediterranean were vulnerable. Ships had to move. Ports had to function. Messages had to be sent. Headquarters had to ask, report, complain, redirect. Allied intelligence, naval power, air reconnaissance, Malta's position, and decrypted or analyzed communications all helped reveal the strain behind Axis movement. A tank without fuel is not a spearhead. It is weight. In Allied command centers, the war in North Africa was studied not only through battlefield reports but through patterns of supply and intention. If shipping was disrupted, Rommel's choices narrowed. If fuel shortages appeared in communications, bold plans became fragile. If troop movements or operational concerns surfaced through intelligence, British commanders could prepare with greater patience. This did not remove uncertainty. El Alamein was not won by a message alone. It was won through soldiers, artillery, minefields, armor, planning, air power, supply, and command decisions made under pressure. But intelligence helped define the battlefield before the battlefield consumed men. The contrast is important. Rommel's visible war was motion. The Allied invisible war was preparation. On the ground, a British infantryman near El Alamein might not know any of this. He knew heat in the day, cold at night, flies, sand in food, sand in weapons, sand in his mouth. He knew the weight of digging. He knew the sound of artillery registering somewhere beyond sight. He knew that when battle came, the desert would no longer feel empty. He did not know which enemy supply message had been read, which convoy had been attacked, which analysis had suggested that the Axis were weaker than their reputation. But he lived inside the consequences. So did the Axis soldier. A German or Italian tanker could be brave, skilled, and disciplined, and still find himself trapped by fuel gauges and ammunition counts. He might see Allied strength gathering and wonder why his own support felt thinner than expected. He might hear that supplies were delayed again. He might watch mechanics try to keep tired machines alive in dust that entered everything. Confidence does not always break in a single moment. Sometimes it drains away through shortages, through delayed trucks, through orders that demand movement the fuel cannot support, through the sense that the enemy seems ready, not surprised. The silent weapon did not defeat Rommel by itself. That would be too simple and false to the texture of war. But it helped expose the difference between reputation and capacity. It helped Allied commanders understand that the feared desert fox operated inside limits, and that those limits could be pressed. What the Axis believed was that speed and daring could keep the enemy off balance. What really happened was that intelligence, supply, and preparation turned speed into a question. How far can you go before the desert closes behind you? In the maps and message rooms, Allied officers learned a lesson that would echo through the rest of the war. The enemy's plan was only one part of the truth. The deeper truth lay in what the enemy could sustain. That is where numbers began to matter. Not as cold statistics, as pressure. A few hours of warning. A few miles of rerouting. A few missing fuel shipments. A convoy that does not arrive. A reserve that moves too late. A message read in time. The mathematics of survival had entered the war. And it was about to show that sometimes the smallest advantage is the one that keeps a man alive. Minutes, miles, signals, and ships. War often turns on numbers too small to look important afterward. A convoy shifted by a few dozen miles. A warning received a few hours earlier. A submarine transmission lasting less than a minute. A reserve unit delayed by a mistaken belief. A message decrypted late, but not too late. Numbers like these do not look like victory in a photograph. They do not produce an image as clear as a flag raised over rubble or a tank burning beside a road. But they alter the conditions under which visible victory becomes possible. The silent weapon worked in time. That was its true domain. A commander with warning possesses something the enemy does not know he has: choice. Not perfect choice. Not safe choice. But a little more room inside the narrow, violent machinery of war. He can move a convoy, shift aircraft, prepare an ambush, reinforce a sector, delay an operation, let deception continue, or do nothing because acting too precisely might reveal the source. This is why intelligence is not the same as knowledge. Knowledge sounds complete. Intelligence is often partial, late, uncertain, and dangerous to use. A decrypted message might suggest an enemy movement, but the translation may arrive after the movement has begun. A traffic pattern might indicate danger, but not its exact form. A direction-finding bearing might place a submarine somewhere along a line, not at a neat point on a map. A report might be accurate and still be ignored because another report appears to contradict it. The mathematics of survival was never clean. It was human beings judging probability while other human beings moved toward death. On the Atlantic routes, convoy speed was limited by the slowest ships. A convoy could not simply run from a wolf pack the way a destroyer might. Merchant ships carried the war's weight and moved accordingly. If intelligence allowed a course change before contact, the effect could be enormous. A few hours mattered because submarines had to intercept. A few miles mattered because the ocean was vast but not infinite. The U-boats had fuel limits, speed limits, battery limits, visibility limits. Information made those limits sharper. In the desert, the same logic applied to supplies. It was not enough to count tanks. One had to ask how many could move, how many could be fueled, how many could be repaired, how much ammunition could reach them, and when. A commander might possess fighting spirit and still be reduced by arithmetic. In Normandy, time became even more severe. If German reserves moved quickly, the beachhead might be threatened before it hardened. If they hesitated, if they waited for a second landing that did not come, if they believed the main blow remained elsewhere, then the Allies gained hours that became roads, artillery positions, unloading zones, and reinforcements. A belief could delay a division. A delay could save a beachhead. That is the strange cruelty of command. Men at the front bleed in minutes created by decisions far behind them. But the Allies faced their own calculation. If they used ultra-derived intelligence too openly, they risked losing access to future messages. Source protection could force restraint. Sometimes reconnaissance was sent to provide a visible explanation for action already prompted by secret knowledge. Sometimes commanders were given conclusions without origins. Sometimes opportunities were not exploited fully because the long-term value of the source outweighed the immediate gain. This is difficult to hear because it means the silent weapon existed inside moral compromise. Could save many by not saving some. A report might indicate danger to a convoy, but if every danger were avoided too perfectly, the enemy might suspect his signals were compromised. A city might be threatened by bombing, but acting on intelligence was entangled with what could be proven, what could be concealed, and what could be done in time. Some popular stories about these choices have been simplified over the years. The real record is more complicated and should be handled carefully. Verify specific cases before final production. What matters here is not a myth of omniscience. The Allies did not know everything. They did not always understand what they knew. They did not always act wisely. The silent weapon was powerful because it improved decisions, not because it removed uncertainty. In war, improving a decision by even a little can matter. A gun crew given an extra 10 minutes can prepare. A fighter squadron warned early can climb. A convoy warned in time can alter course. A commander who knows the enemy's belief can choose whether to confirm it, exploit it, or leave it undisturbed. The Axis believed that battles began when armies collided. What really happened was that many battles began earlier, in the contest over who had more time to think. And time, once lost, cannot be reinforced. You can send more tanks. You can send more ships. You can send more men. You cannot send yesterday's warning. This is why the silent weapon was so dangerous to confidence. It did not need to destroy every plan. It only had to make enough plans arrive late, fail strangely, or meet resistance too well prepared to be coincidence. Over time, commanders begin to feel patterns they cannot explain. The enemy is waiting. The convoy is gone. The supply ship is hit. The reserve is delayed. The deception still holds. And somewhere, a man looking at a map begins to wonder whether the war he sees is already behind the war the enemy knows. But numbers cannot carry the whole story. They never can. For every calculation, there was a body. For every warning, there was someone not warned. For every convoy that reached port, another burned. The silent weapon changed odds, but it did not make war merciful. That truth belongs to the people who paid the price. When secrets could not save everyone. There were nights when the warning came too late. There were mornings when it came in time but could not be used. There were messages that suggested danger without proving enough. Reports that sat inside channels too restricted to move quickly. Signals that made sense only after the attack had already begun. Conclusions that looked obvious in hindsight and uncertain when men still had to decide. The silent weapon could reduce blindness, could not abolish tragedy. A merchant ship torpedoed in the Atlantic did not sink differently because someone in Britain had tried to read the enemy. Steel still tore. Steam still screamed. Men still ran through tilted corridors while lights failed and water climbed. Lifeboats still dropped into black water. Oil still spread across the surface. A sailor still looked for his friend and found only wreckage. For the survivors, intelligence was invisible. Loss was not. This is the part of the story that must not be softened. Code-breaking, signals intelligence, and deception were extraordinary achievements. They saved lives. They shortened dangers. They helped commanders see through fog that had swallowed armies before. But they did not make war clean. They did not turn death into an equation that could be balanced neatly afterward. Every secret advantage carried a human cost because every use of it required judgment under limits. If the Allies acted too directly, the source might be exposed. If they acted too cautiously, people might die. If they waited for confirmation, the chance might vanish. If they moved on partial information, they might send men into the wrong danger. The burden was not only intellectual. It was moral, and it was carried quietly. Think of an intelligence officer reading a decrypted fragment that indicates possible movement. Not certainty, possible movement. He knows the value of caution. He knows the danger of delay. He knows that someone higher up will ask what the source is or how reliable or whether action can be disguised. The paper in his hand is not heavy, but it may as well be. Elsewhere, a convoy moves. Elsewhere, a desert unit waits. Elsewhere, a family will receive a telegram written in language too formal for grief. The people in the secret rooms could not attend every funeral. They could not explain to families what had been known, what had not been known, what had been risked, what had been lost to protect the larger war. Many were forbidden from speaking of their work for decades. The silence that made the weapon effective also trapped its operators inside private memory. A woman who had copied messages through night shifts might return home after the war and say almost nothing. A man who had helped break traffic might sit at a family table while others discuss battles in terms of generals and tanks. He might know that the story was larger. He might also know he had signed papers and made promises. Silence became a second uniform. There is a loneliness in that. Victory usually seeks witnesses. Medals, parades, official histories, unit citations. The silent war produced far fewer visible traces at first. Its participants were asked to disappear back into ordinary life. They had helped read an enemy's mind, and then they were told to become ordinary citizens again. Some managed. Some carried the weight. And what of the enemy? It is important to remember that Axis soldiers on the receiving end of this invisible advantage were often men with limited knowledge of the larger system. A U-boat radio operator sending a report might not imagine that the act of transmission could endanger his crew. A German infantryman in Normandy might not know that higher command was trapped inside a deception picture. An Italian sailor aboard a supply vessel might not know that intelligence, reconnaissance, and Allied attack planning had converged upon his route. They too lived inside decisions made above them. They too paid for beliefs they did not create. This is why a serious documentary cannot treat the silent weapon as a magic trick. It was not a clever shortcut that made suffering disappear. It was a tool that changed probabilities in a war where probabilities were paid for in blood. The Allies believed, increasingly, that intelligence could shape battle before contact. What really happened was more complicated. It shaped battle but never fully controlled it. There were still storms, mistakes, mechanical failures, misread signals, stubborn commanders, broken radios, bad assumptions, delays, human fear, human pride, human exhaustion. The battlefield always kept some part of itself beyond calculation. And yet, because the silent weapon could not save everyone, the lives it did save become even more important to understand. A convoy that arrived meant soldiers fed, aircraft repaired, civilians sustained. A deception that held meant fewer German units reaching the beaches in time. A warning acted upon meant men who never knew they had been spared. Survival often leaves no monument, only absence. The attack that did not happen. The ship that was not sunk. The order that arrived late. The enemy confidence that faltered before it could become action. But somewhere in Axis headquarters, failures began to gather. Convoys missed, supplies lost, plans anticipated, deceptions believed too long. Commanders began to sense something beneath events. Not proof, a feeling. The war seemed to be answering them before they had spoken. And that feeling, once it entered command, was dangerous. The enemy feels the pattern but cannot name it. A commander can accept defeat more easily when he understands it. A stronger enemy, bad weather, shortage of fuel, poor timing, failed attack, a broken unit. These are bitter, but they belong to the known world. They can be written into reports. Blame can be assigned. Lessons can be drawn. What corrodes confidence more deeply is failure that seems to arrive from nowhere. The convoy that should have been intercepted is gone. The supply ship is attacked. The enemy defense is ready. The expected confusion does not occur. The deception that should have been recognized remains strangely convincing. At first, each event can be explained alone. War is full of chance. Reconnaissance sees things. Spies exist. Radar improves. Prisoners talk. Patrols stumble upon information. Commanders make lucky guesses. But repetition changes the mind. German Naval Command could not ignore U-boat losses forever. Field commanders could not ignore Allied anticipation forever. Axis intelligence officers had to ask whether security had failed somewhere. Were codes compromised? Were agents leaking information? Were procedures careless? Were radio operators undisciplined? Was the enemy simply becoming better through other means? The truth was difficult to grasp because it was not one truth. Allied advantage came from many sources at once. Codebreaking, traffic analysis, direction finding, radar, aerial reconnaissance, resistance networks, captured documents, prisoner interrogation, deception, industrial strength, improved training, better escort tactics, air superiority. The silent weapon was powerful partly because it hid among other explanations. If an aircraft found a submarine after a transmission, radar might be blamed. If a supply convoy was attacked, reconnaissance might be blamed. If German reserves were delayed at D-Day, Allied deception and German assumptions could be blamed without fully understanding how carefully those assumptions had been monitored. The enemy felt the effects. He could not always name the cause. This uncertainty wounded command. Inside a headquarters, maps are supposed to reduce chaos. They give the illusion that war can be arranged. Units become symbols. Roads become lines. Coastlines become problems to solve. If information is reliable, a map can help. If information is poisoned by wrong beliefs, a map becomes dangerous. Axis command increasingly had to operate in a world where Allied reactions sometimes appeared too timely. The psychological question was brutal. Is the enemy lucky, better informed, or inside our system? Each answer demanded a different response. If he is lucky, continue. If he is better informed through reconnaissance, conceal more. If he is inside the system, everything spoken may be dangerous. But modern war could not simply stop speaking. That was the trap. A radio operator could be ordered to maintain discipline. Codes could be changed. Procedures tightened. But divisions still needed orders. U-boats still needed coordination. Aircraft still needed instructions. Supply systems still needed reports. The more pressure the Axis came under, the more communication it needed. The more communication it needed, the more opportunities the Allies had to listen. It was a circle with tightening walls. For the men at lower levels, the pattern might appear as frustration. A submarine ordered toward a convoy finds nothing. An airfield is struck after preparations were thought concealed. A column moves and meets resistance that seems too ready. Rumors circulate. Someone must have talked. Someone must have made a mistake. Someone must have betrayed the plan. Rumor is what confidence becomes when evidence is missing. And once rumor enters a fighting force, it does not need proof to do damage. It makes men second-guess procedures. It makes officers distrust reports. It makes commanders hesitate over decisions that once seemed clear. In a war of movement, hesitation can be fatal. In a war of deception, hesitation can be exploited. In a war of logistics, hesitation consumes time that cannot be restored. This is how a silent weapon breaks confidence before battle. Not by convincing the enemy that he has already lost. That would be too simple. It breaks confidence by making him unsure which part of his understanding can still be trusted. Are the codes safe? Is the convoy route known? Is the enemy landing here or elsewhere? Is this attack real or a diversion? Is silence safety or evidence of paralysis? The Allies learned to weaponize not only information but belief. They did not always need the Germans to know the truth. Sometimes they needed them to keep believing a lie. Sometimes they needed them to doubt the right warning. Sometimes they needed them to wait. Nowhere did this matter more than in 1944. The invasion of France required ships, aircraft, troops, engineering, weather judgment, courage, and luck. But it also required something less visible. The Allies had to enter France while a large part of German command still looked toward the wrong coastline. In that moment, intelligence and deception fused. The silent weapon stopped being only a means of reading the enemy. It became a way of measuring whether the enemy was still trapped inside the story the Allies had written for him. And the clock was moving toward Normandy. D-Day and the battle before the battle. By the spring of 1944, southern England had become a place of waiting. Roads were crowded with vehicles painted for invasion. Fields held temporary camps. Ports filled with landing craft, supply ships, barges, cranes, fuel lines, ammunition stacks, and men trying to hide nerves behind jokes, cards, cigarettes, and routine. Aircraft droned overhead so often that the sound became part of the weather. Everyone knew something was coming. The Germans knew it too. They had known for years that the Allies would eventually cross the Channel. The question was where. Normandy was possible. Pas-de-Calais was obvious. It was the shortest crossing, closest to Germany, and strategically logical enough that German commanders could not ignore it. The Allies understood this expectation and fed it. Operation Fortitude built an army out of signals, deception, controlled agents, dummy equipment, misleading movements, and the carefully managed image of General George Patton. The false First U.S. Army Group existed to occupy German attention. Fake radio traffic gave it a voice. Inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft gave reconnaissance something to see. Double agents gave German intelligence something to believe. But deception is fragile. It must be monitored. A lie only works if the enemy continues to accept it. And here the silent weapon became invaluable. Through ultra and related intelligence, the Allies could assess German reactions. They could see, in part, whether the deception picture was holding. Not perfectly, not with godlike certainty, but enough to know that German belief remained vulnerable in the way the Allies needed. This was not merely intelligence. It was psychological engineering under wartime pressure. The landings themselves were brutal and physical. Nothing about signals intelligence made Omaha Beach soft. Nothing about deception removed the terror of men jumping into deep water under fire, or engineers clearing obstacles, or medics crawling through sand, or infantry pressing forward because staying still meant dying in place. The visible battle was real, but behind it was another battle time. The Allies did not need German command to sleep forever. They needed hesitation, confusion, delay. They needed the Germans to wonder whether Normandy was the main invasion or the first act of something larger. They needed forces near Pas-de-Calais to remain tied to a threat that did not exist in the form imagined. A belief held long enough can become a battlefield obstacle. German reserves were not simply pieces on a board waiting to move. Their movement depended on command authority, assumptions, communications, fuel, roads, air attack, and the interpretation of events. If senior leaders believed the main blow might still fall elsewhere, the response to Normandy would be constrained by that belief. And beliefs do not die instantly when contradicted. They resist. On June 6th, as Allied troops fought for beach exits and airborne units struggled in scattered darkness, German command wrestled with uncertainty. Reports came in. Some were accurate, some confused, some delayed, some distorted by the chaos of airborne drops, naval bombardment, resistance activity, disrupted communications, and the sheer shock of invasion. Was this the main attack? Was Calais still threatened? Should reserves be released? How much strength should be committed? Every hour mattered. On the beaches, an hour could mean more landing craft arriving, more men ashore, more artillery unloaded, more engineers clearing routes inland. An hour could mean the difference between a fragile foothold and a position too deep to throw back into the sea. The silent weapon's role was not to replace courage. It was to help preserve the conditions in which courage could matter. An infantryman in Normandy did not feel saved by deception. He felt the weight of wet gear, the snap of bullets, the blast of shells, the desperate need to move. A medic did not think of fortitude while pressing a bandage into a wound. A naval officer under fire did not think of code rooms while trying to keep landing craft moving. But the German delay, the uncertainty, the reserves held back by belief, these shaped the world around them. What the Axis believed was that they could identify the main invasion and crush it with prepared force. What really happened was that the Allies attacked not only the coast, but the German understanding of the coast. The false army at Calais had no real tanks worth counting. Yet it held real German attention. The fake radio traffic carried no men into battle. Yet it helped keep real German formations watching the wrong horizon. The silent weapon did not shout over the guns of Normandy. It did not need to. It had already done its work in the minds of commanders who could not be fully certain. And uncertainty on June 6th was not neutral. It favored the side already on the beaches. By the time German command understood the full shape of the invasion, The first critical hours had passed. The Allies had paid heavily, but they were ashore. The battle for France would be long, bitter, and costly, but the chance to destroy the invasion at the waterline had begun to slip away. In the end, the weapon that helped protect D-Day was not only secrecy. It was the enemy's belief, kept alive just long enough to become a cage. After the war, the beaches would be remembered. The aircraft, the ships, the airborne drops, the faces of young men moving into fire. The secret rooms would remain quieter. For many who worked there, the silence would last decades. The war won in silence. When the war ended, the machines stopped before the memories did. Ships came home. Camps emptied. Uniforms were folded away. Men who had slept in mud returned to streets that seemed too ordinary. Women who had spent years inside secret work stepped back into civilian life carrying knowledge they could not unpack at the family table. Files were locked. Buildings grew quiet. The work that had helped shape battles vanished into official silence. For a long time, the story of the silent weapon remained incomplete. People remembered the battles they could see. They remembered tanks in ruins, bombers over Europe, landing craft at Normandy, convoys in gray seas, soldiers in desert dust, submarines surfacing through cold water. They remembered generals and speeches, maps and dates, victories and defeats. They did not fully know about the listeners. Not at first. They did not know how many nights had been spent copying signals. How many patterns had been studied. How many messages had been broken partly, late, imperfectly, but still usefully. How many decisions had been shaped by information that could not be named. How many enemy assumptions had been quietly tested, confirmed, exploited, or left undisturbed. The legacy of signals intelligence was not only that it helped win battles. It changed the meaning of battle. After World War II, no serious military power could pretend that war was only a contest of visible strength. Tanks, aircraft, ships, artillery, and soldiers remained essential. Courage remained essential. Industry remained essential. But information had revealed itself as something close to terrain. Invisible terrain, but terrain nonetheless. A commander could occupy it, lose it, misread it, or be trapped by it. The Axis had believed, in different ways and at different moments, that secrecy was something a machine could guarantee. That speed could outrun interpretation. That radio gave command without creating vulnerability. That surprise belonged to the side that planned the blow. What really happened was harsher. Every system built by humans carried human weaknesses. Every message sent into the air left a trace. Every belief about the enemy could become a weapon if the enemy learned how to measure it. Before the battle even began, confidence could be softened, redirected, delayed, and broken. Not always, never perfectly, but often enough to matter. The silent weapon did not win the war alone. No honest history should claim that. The war was won by millions of people doing difficult, dangerous, exhausting work across every front. Infantrymen, sailors, pilots, mechanics, nurses, engineers, factory workers, codebreakers, drivers, resistance couriers, merchant crews, radio operators, commanders who made good decisions, and ordinary people who endured the consequences of bad ones. But the silent weapon changed the conditions under which many of them fought. It gave warning where there might have been blindness. It gave time where there might have been surprise. It gave commanders a glimpse of enemy belief, and sometimes that glimpse was enough. Return, for a moment, to that room in southern England before dawn on June 6, 1944. The rain at the window, the headphones, the paper. The young operator listening through static while men far away moved toward the coast. She did not stop the bullets on Omaha Beach. She did not silence the guns above the sand. She did not erase fear from the landing craft or grief from the hospitals that followed. But she was part of something larger than one room, one message, one night. A system of listening that turned enemy confidence into evidence. A hidden labor that made secrecy less certain. A weapon whose greatest proof was often an event that did not happen. The convoy not found, the reserve not released, the trap not sprung, the invasion not thrown back before it could breathe. They believed their secrets were locked inside machines. But what really happened was that war forced those secrets into the air, where patient hands and tired eyes began taking them apart. They believed battles began when the guns opened. But what really happened was that some battles had already begun in silence. And in war, silence can be a weapon if someone is listening. Final CTA. If you watch this from a place touched by the history of World War II, share where you are watching from in the comments. And if someone in your family served at sea, in the air, on the ground, in a hospital, in a factory, or in work they were never allowed to speak about, you are welcome to leave their story below. Subscribe to WW2 Warfront for more forgotten stories of what they believed and what really happened.